Our next song will be An Empty Mansion. Here I labor and toil. Before we're led in a prayer to dismiss us to our classes, we're going to sing Till the Storm Passes By. Till the storm passes by. In the dawn of the midnight have I walked in my face while the storm howls above me and there's no hiding place. Near the crash of the thunder, precious Lord, hear my cry. Keep me safe.
Please bow your head. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for allowing us to gather here tonight to learn more about you and about your Son, whom you sent down to earth for our prayers to save us, even though we may be Gentiles. Please help the teachers remember their lessons tonight and let everyone get home safely and keep your healing hands upon those who need it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thanks, sir.
Well, it is about time for us to get started. If you would be turning in your Bibles to Numbers 22, that's where we're going to get started tonight. Numbers 22, we're going to be in Lesson 11. If you have your book with you, we're going to be starting on page 38. Tonight's lesson is titled Trouble with Moab and Midian. And so we're going to be primarily talking about two separate stories, but they really are just one story and they're pretty closely connected. But before we get into these stories, this trouble that we have with Moab and Midian, I want to kind of do a review of who Moab and Midian were, both as individuals, but also as nations. So if you look at our map, you've seen this map before, and if you look on the right or to the east, we have the land of Midian down here, and then we have Edom up here. And so we're, like we talked about in our last class a couple weeks ago, we're slowly making our way. We're spending about 40 years right in this section. So we have Moab up here and then Midian right here. So these are going to be nations that are right next to the people of Israel. And these are also nations that are related to the people of Israel. So if we look at a family tree, and we go back a few generations, you'll notice some familiar names. We have the Moabites right here that we're going to be talking about, so they're related to Lot, and then we have obviously Abraham and the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So then here we get to the Israelites. But Abraham, as we've mentioned in past classes, we have Midian, who was also a son of Abraham. So there's a couple connections here to not only back to Abraham, back to the Israelites, and we kind of have the Midianites in one place and the Moabites in another. As we know, if you know your Old Testament history, you know that intermarrying with foreign nations is going to be a major issue for the Israelites, and really a lot of that trouble starts tonight. That's going to start here. We've talked extensively in past classes about the ideas of purity and holiness and sanctification and being this people that are set apart. And so that's something to think about too when we're talking about the Israelites. We're talking about this nation. There's these 12 tribes, and they're going to the promised land. They're related to Abraham, obviously, as you see here. But in their conduct, they're meant to act a certain way. And so part of that idea of purity and part of that idea of cleanliness and the morality that they have and the laws that they've been given by God, that is coming from, obviously it's coming from God, but that is, all of those things are meant to set them apart from other nations. We've talked about in past classes some of the laws that maybe kind of might make you scratch your head, like why are they in there, talking about mixing different fabrics and things like that. We don't have laws. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution about what fabrics you wear, right? But again, just driving home that idea of purity and holiness and being a people that are set apart for God, God's holy chosen nation. So I want to get started with comparing a few verses. And so like we did a couple classes ago, I'm going to need some volunteers. We're going to go through 3 sets of verses here to just kind of give us some context and get us started talking about these things. So one is going to be, can I get a volunteer to read Numbers 13, verses 32 and 33, and then another volunteer to read Numbers 22, verses 2 through 4. Stephen, can you do Numbers 13, and then JD, Numbers 22, 2 through 4. So go ahead and read those, and then we'll talk about it. 13, 32, and 33.
Saying, this land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight.
Okay, thank you. And then JD?
Now, 22, 2 through 4, right?
Yes.
Now, Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was exceedingly afraid of the people because they were many, and Moab was sick with dread because of the children of Israel. So Moab said to the elders of Midian, now this company will lift up everything around the ox licks up grass of the field. And Balak, son of Zippor, was king of the Moabites at that time.
Okay, thank you. So what irony jumps out to you reading those two verses?
The Israelites were concerned they would be consumed, and now the Moabites are concerned they're going to be consumed.
Exactly. It's interesting to see this kind of this irony of the Israelites are viewing how the Israelites view others versus how others view the Israelites. So part of the big point of what we talked about a couple classes ago with the spies, right, is they're being blessed with this land. They're meant to go into the land of Canaan, and they see the richness of the land. They see how big the fruit is. They see how big the people are. And rather than saying, oh, wow, this is an incredible place, God's really blessed us with this place, this land that flows with milk and honey, they see that and say, and as Stephen read, we were as grasshoppers in our own eyes. But then you kind of see this other metaphor, if you will, in how after all the victories that they've had, they've defeated King Sihon, King Og, so they've already had a couple of military victories, and I love that metaphor of thinking about they're going to eat us up just like a cow eating grass, right? That's quite the defeat, right? That's not really a battle between a cow and some grass. And so I just want to get our minds thinking about what the reaction should have been, right? For when they're coming out of the land of Egypt, they've already had these victories, and so they're seeing the things that God are doing. And the surrounding nations, obviously there's not like 6 o'clock news or anything like that, but word's going to travel, right? They're going to know what these military victories look like. They're going to hear about these military defeats, and they're going to see just how massive, just this huge amount of people. Stephen?
So, the land of Canaan didn't include Moab, right?
No.
So they were fearful for nothing, right? I mean, they were being afraid. They're saying they're going to come take our land and consume us when that's not the land that God promised them, right? Am I right on that?
I believe so. I don't want to act like I'm more sure than I am. I am pretty sure. But that's a great point that, they're not even included in that, but still just the intimidation of, oh, they clearly have a God on their side. Again, whatever the Moabites would have thought, they think they're next, right? So they think the Israelites are just going to come and just wipe out everybody. But again, just kind of juxtaposing, if you will, if the people on the outside can see it, right? The people on the outside can see, oh, here's how God's working for them. But then the Israelites in the middle of it, right, can't see it. They're like, oh, God just brought us out into the wilderness to die. He's not going to bring us into the land of Canaan. He can't do it. Can I get a volunteer to read Genesis 12, and then another volunteer to read Genesis 12, verses 2 through 5, and then Numbers 22, 6. Eric, Genesis 12, 2 through 5, and then Chris, Numbers 22, 6.
I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you and all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan.
Okay.
Numbers 22, verse 6. Therefore, please come at once and curse this people for me, for they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land, for I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed.
Okay, so in the passage that Eric read, who's talking to who? God's talking to Abraham, right? And then in the passage that Chris just read, who's talking to who? Balak is talking to Balaam. Okay, so we see this language of whoever you bless is blessed, whoever you curse is cursed. And so if you prepared for Bible class, you know how this is going to go, right? But if everybody who God blesses is blessed, we have that on one hand, right? But then Balaam apparently has this prestige or has this notoriety in a sense of whoever you bless is blessed and whoever you curse is cursed. So if we kind of pit those two things against each other, as we're going to see with what happens with Balak and Balaam, God's going to win that battle, right? If God says that Abraham's lineage is going to be blessed, if God says that the Israelites are going to be blessed, try as he might, Balaam can do his worst. There's all these different people involved trying to curse the Israelites, but if God has said that they are going to be blessed and God has set them apart to be blessed, they are going to be blessed. So then we have God's promise to Abraham versus Balak talking to Balaam about how great he is, and this notoriety kind of that he has. Exodus 14, 11 and 12. We're not going to read 16, 3 and 4. It basically says the same thing as chapter 14, verses 11 and 12. But can I get a volunteer to read Exodus 14, verses 11 and 12, and then another volunteer to read Numbers 22, 5 and 6. Okay, so can you read Exodus 14, 11 through 12, Chris, and then someone else? Oh, Tanya, can you read Numbers 22, 5 and 6?
Then they said to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness."
Go ahead.
Sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, at Pether, which is near the river in the land of the people of Ammon, to call him, saying, "Behold, the people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the earth, and they are dwelling opposite me. Come now, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land, for I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed."
Okay, so on the one hand, again, just kind of building up this divide between this, just kind of juxtaposition between how the Israelites are viewing themselves and what they're thinking about themselves coming out of Egypt versus what everyone else is seeing. And so it's kind of like, have you ever been talking to a friend and they're talking about how, their situation is so bad and everything's, they're talking about something and it's like, do you not, everyone around you is kind of seeing this a completely different way, but because you're in the thick of it, right, you kind of have this skewed view of what's going on. And so you see the Israelites, they say it over and over again. There were multiple verses that we could have read, but Israel thinks God only freed them to kill them. They say this over and over again. Have you not just brought us out into the land, out into the wilderness to kill us? You just brought us out here so that we could starve out here. Why did you free us? Why are we here? But then the other nations around them are seeing the power of their deliverance. They're like, did you hear about this massive amount of people that just escaped from the Egyptians? Have you heard about the plagues that happened in Egypt? Have you heard of everything that happened to the Egyptians? The Pharaoh died because the sea opened up, all of these incredible things. And so they're coming out into the world, out of Egypt, and everyone's petrified of them. And then they're not really rising to the task because they can't see what's right in front of them, unfortunately. Ben?
Yeah, just going back to what Stephen had mentioned, it doesn't appear that that part of the land of Moab would be part of Canaan and the Promised Land, but the fact that you got almost 1 million people now walking through, there's just a lot of great danger. You don't know what they're going to do. So that was not a part of the land allotted to them in Joshua, but nonetheless, it would have been pretty intimidating.
Exactly, and there's kind of a distinction there too between how worldly war, if you want to put it that way, how the world looks at a mass of people coming towards them versus God saying, that's not in my plan, that's not how this is going to work. And so you would think from a human military perspective, if there's millions of people coming towards your country or your nation or your land or whatever, you would think, oh, they're just going to wipe us out on the way, because historically that's just kind of how politics works, right? But again, you see that distinction there between God's going to do exactly what he's going to do, and you see that in how Balaam talks about these oracles and everything. So let's go ahead and get into the story of Balaam and Balak. Reading through, I just want to kind of set up, we're not going to read all of these verses. We've read the highlights already of Numbers 22, verses 1 through 6, but the Moabites are scared of the Israelites as they're coming out of Egypt. But then in verses 7 through 12, God makes it clear that his people are going to be blessed. In verse 7, so the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian, that's really important too, just that you might not think there's anything there, but seeing that the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian are kind of in cahoots is kind of an important detail, because we're going to see Moabites and Midianites come up in other places in Scripture, specifically in the book of Judges. And so with what's going to happen the rest of this class, with what we're about to cover and what we're getting into, it's important to note that the Moabites and the Midianites are working together. Also, like we mentioned at the beginning of class, that they're related. But they departed with the fees for divination in their hand, and they came to Balaam and gave him Balak's message. And he said to him, "Lodge here tonight, and I will bring back word to you as the Lord speaks to me." So the princes of Moab stayed with Balaam, and God came to Balaam and said, "Who are these men with you?" And Balaam said to God, "Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent to me, saying, Behold, a people has come out of Egypt, and it covers the face of the earth. Now come, curse them for me. Perhaps I shall be able to fight against them and drive them out." God said to Balaam, "You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." And so then we're going to kind of see this back and forth, but you think about, to all the parents, I would ask you, how many times do you have to tell your kids something before you expect them to listen? Once, right? And so, in some ways, the story would be very different if it ended here, right? And it just ended with, God said no, I'm sorry you want to curse this people, but this is God's chosen people, but this isn't happening. God said no, we're done. And this could have been a very short conversation, and in some ways it would be a lot less exciting, but and it would also have been a lot less messy. So verses 7 through 12, God makes it very clear. God will not be stopped in blessing his people. These are his chosen people. Verses 13 through 19, Balak tries harder, right? He kind of thinks that this is a money issue, and it's like, oh, you weren't impressed with my first entourage? I'll send my better entourage, right? I'll send even more dignified people and even more money, and I'll write an even bigger check. And so Balak, as a king who's trying to, again, this human military mindset of these people are a threat, and I have all the money at my disposal, I can do whatever I want, and so I am going to neutralize this threat at whatever it costs, right? I'll do whatever it takes. But then things really start to get interesting. It's already interesting, but then things get especially interesting. In Numbers chapter 22 and verse 20, God came to Balaam at night and said to him, "If the men have come to call you, rise, go with them, but only do what I tell you." So Balaam rose in the morning and saddled his donkey and went with the princes of Moab. But God's anger was kindled because he went, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as his adversary. Now he was riding on the donkey, and his two servants were with him. Now, if you read that, and you're just kind of, maybe you're reading fast or you're just kind of reading along, you might kind of come to a screeching halt when you read that, because it sounds like God says, okay, now you're allowed to go, and then all of the sudden, it seems as if all of the sudden God is mad. You just told him he could go. Now you're stopping him. Now you're mad at him. I'm confused. And as people of faith, it might be one of those moments where I'm just going to keep reading. I don't feel like I'm allowed to ask that question, but I want to address that, right? Because that's natural, right? I remember when I first read this as I was preparing for this class, I was like, oh wait, I remember that a donkey talks. I don't remember this part, right? And so if you look at verse 34, if you skip down to verse 34, this is obviously skipping forward a little bit, but then Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned, for I did not know that you stood in the road against me. Now therefore, if it is evil in your sight, I will turn back." So we kind of see this flip-flop on Balaam's part, right, where it almost seems as if he wants to go, right? At certain parts he says, I'm not going to do anything that God tells me I can't do. But one thing I noticed as I was kind of reading about this was when it says in verse 20, God came to Balaam at night and said to him, "If the men have come to call you, rise and go with them, but only do what I tell you." Apparently, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, I don't know Hebrew at all. But apparently the way that reads in Hebrew, it's more as if God is saying, if they come to you, like if they initiate it, if they come to you in the morning and say, okay, come with us, then you go. But then notice how it reads, Balaam is getting packed up first thing, and he's ready to go out the door. So I almost think of this as God saying, you make them come to me. You make them come ask us. You don't get to go, you don't get to initiate this. You're not going to go to them, but if they come and ask you. So basically, Balaam's getting ahead of himself. Balaam's getting a little bit too excited because, again, let's be real. Okay, this entourage comes along and is saying, you're this really great prophet, you're this really great guy, whoever you bless is blessed, whoever you curse is cursed, we have all this money, we have this huge entourage, if you don't like this entourage, we'll send another one, we really want you to come with us, we really want you to do this for us. And Balaam, which is good, he has the wherewithal at least to say, no, I'm not going to go beyond what the Lord has said, I'm not going to do more or less than what God has said, but it does seem to read as if he's a little bit too excited to go. And that's why I say Balaam is a little bit too eager, but also you see, you get to kind of see Balaam's interpretation of things in verse 34. When he's stopped, when there's an angel in his way, and when he finally realizes there's an angel in his way, of course, there's the part in the middle, right, that we kind of skipped over where the donkey is sitting down, and then the donkey crushes his leg, and he's mad at the donkey, right, and then the donkey speaks to him. But the fact that Balaam apologizes so fast, I think, is a huge indicator that Balaam knew he did something wrong. Balaam doesn't say, wait, God, I thought you told me I could go, and now you're mad at me for going. That's not what Balaam says. Balaam says, I'm sorry, you're right. It seems as if Balaam got ahead of himself and got a little bit too excited. But one thing I wanted to mention, too, in the next section, verses 23 through 33, is Balak is trying to impress Balaam, right, with this huge entourage, this big group of people, but all the Lord needs is a donkey. And I just think that is so incredible because you see that with Jesus all the time, right? Where just the way people comment on just the way he talks, just the things he says, just the way he carries himself and the things he does, it's so authoritative. He's just so powerful. And he doesn't have to have he doesn't have to act like a Pharisee. The Pharisees had all this pomp and circumstance and all this, carry themselves like we are really important, right? And then Jesus is just a humble carpenter's son, but again, just by the way he talks. And so it's incredible to see kind of the different ways of operating here, where the Lord doesn't need silver and gold and dignitaries and an entourage. He can make a donkey talk because he's the creator of the universe. And so that's all he needs to do. Ben?
Yeah, verse 34, Balaam says, I have sinned. So, that goes back to verse 32. The angel said, I've come out as an adversary because your way was contrary to me. So he had some ulterior motives. He knew that his actions, it wasn't just a mere mistake. It was sinful. It was intentional. And that's where the New Testament gives us some commentary of what's really going on with Balaam and what's really driving some of these decisions.
Exactly. No, that's a great point. Yes, Stephen?
In 2 Peter 2:15, it brings this up as well. It says, they have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness, that he was rebuked for his iniquity, a dumb donkey speaking with a man's voice, restraining the madness of the prophets. So we know what the motivation was, why he was leaping to that conclusion that, hey, I'm going to get up in the morning and go. He was greedy.
Exactly, right. So there's definitely more to this. We're actually going to end tonight's class with looking a little bit at we're going to talk about this, and then we're going to skip to Midian, but we're going to kind of come back to some of those things. So I'm glad y'all brought that up. We are going to circle back around to that. But we do get more color in the New Testament as far as what his motivation is. So again, some people, I just wanted to address that because it can be, like I said, it can be easy to read it that way, where it seems very contradictory and very obvious in a certain way if you read it a certain way. But we definitely see more of his motives from other texts and from even later in the same text. So Balak is obviously offended. Balaam knows who's in charge. We see this back and forth between Balaam is in a sense trying to do what's right, but again, Balaam is obviously motivated by other things, and then Balak is just kind of confused about what's going on. But then you really see that in the next couple of chapters. So in Numbers 23, we read Balaam's first oracle. So again, this back and forth between over and over again, Balak, and we've seen with the Pharaoh of Egypt, you see with Nebuchadnezzar, you see with Belteshazzar, you see this all over the Bible where the God of the universe versus the most powerful men on the planet is no match at all, right? And so if you're trying to curse God's people, if you're trying to go up against God's people, if what you're trying to do is flying in the face of what God's trying to do, you will lose every single time. And so you see these curses that are meant to be blessings. That's why I wanted to read Genesis at the beginning. We read the promises to Abraham. When God says these people will be blessed, you get the most powerful king on the planet, and you get the most powerful prophet, magician, sorcerer on the planet, and team them up, still no match for the God of the universe. And so then we get to chapter 24, and then we have Balaam's third blessing. So again, curse them again, try it a different way, and then they just keep being blessings. So I want to go ahead and read Balaam's final oracle in Numbers 24 and verse 15. And he took up his discourse and said, "The oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down but with his eyes uncovered. I see him but not now. I behold him but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir also, his enemy, shall be dispossessed. Israel is doing valiantly. And one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities." Then he looked on Amalek and took up his discourse and said, "Amalek was the first among the nations, but its end is utter destruction." And he looked on the Kenite and took up his discourse and said, "Enduring is your dwelling place, and your nest is set in the rock. Nevertheless, Cain shall be burned when Asher takes you away captive." And he took up his discourse and said, "Alas, who shall live when God does this? But ships shall come from Kittim and shall afflict Asher and Eber, and he too shall come to utter destruction." Then Balaam rose and went back to his place, and Balak also went his way. And so we see these. God is going to speak. You're not going to twist God's arm. You're not going to force God's hand and force him to speak against someone who he is not going to speak against. He had already spoken, going back to Moab, what we mentioned about Moab wasn't on the list of the people that were going to be dispossessed and the people that were going to be kicked out of the land of Canaan. We see in many ways the lists of Canaanites and the different tribes and everything. We see those people named. But again, if God's going to bless a people, he is going to bless them. And if God's going to curse a people, he's going to curse them. Which brings us to Numbers 25. So we have a pretty incredible story here with Numbers 25. And again, just coming off the heels of what just happened with Balaam and Balak and what Balak is trying to accomplish here. But I want to, before we get to Numbers 25, just kind of as context and to think about what's about to happen here, will you turn with me to Matthew chapter 5? And I want to read what a teaching of Jesus that I think is about to be reflected in a very large scale in what's about to happen here in Numbers 25 and chapter 31. But in Matthew chapter 5, verse 28, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about lust, and he says, if we just start in verse 27, "You have heard it said that you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And then this is really the part I want to hone in on. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better for you to lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. So, pretty powerful stuff, right? Pretty incredible teaching, pretty serious teaching, right? We don't read that passage lightly. We don't talk about that passage lightly. Now, again, when we talk about that passage, obviously, I want to be super clear, we're not talking about literally mutilating yourself to avoid sin. But I think if there's a lesson to be learned in what happens with the Midianites in Numbers 31, it's that God will go to extraordinary lengths to keep his people pure. And I think that's kind of more or less what we see happening with this trouble that we have with Midian. It's sexual in nature. It starts with lust. It starts with adultery. It starts with intermarriage. And so when God goes to these extraordinary lengths to keep his people pure, that's what we see happening. So in Numbers, let's go back to Numbers 25 and just kind of be thinking about, as we read this, what is your gut reaction to what Phinehas is doing here? What are you kind of thinking of when this happens? So in chapter 25 of Numbers 25 and verse 1, while Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel." And Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor." And behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family, in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. Thus the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. So, we read that, and we know the Bible teaches against sexual immorality, right? And we know that sexual immorality has devastating effects, right? But I'll just ask you all, what is your gut reaction to what Phinehas is doing here? What do you see Phinehas doing here? What's your first thought, Stephen?
I mean, he's certainly committed, but his actions, I mean, my first just carnal reaction is there's no mercy. You know, he's just mercilessly, we're going to kill him. I mean, let's just get rid of it. But he's purging. I mean, it's at God's command. He's purging those that have sinned. And that was God's decision on their punishment.
Exactly. So there's that conflict there, right? Of that seems really extraordinary, right? That seems really intense and really harsh and really merciless, right, in a sense. But again, if we're talking about God keeping his people clean and God keeping his people pure at all costs, and they're determined to whore after these people and yoke themselves with these people and have this relationship with these people, these are the lengths that God has to go to keep his people pure. Ben?
About verse 8, after he killed the man and the woman, and their names are mentioned later on, it says, "So the plague on the sons of Israel was checked." So another reason why he may have just took this extreme action immediately, no one else is doing it, or at least he's standing out with these two people in particular, is because he's seen what's happening with the plague. The plague is breaking out. 24,000, people are dying. So unless something is done fast, this is going to continue on.
Right. And it's incredible to think about it that way, right? Where, again, when we talk about sexual immorality having devastating effects, we can list what those look like. We know what those things look like. But it's not literally thousands of people starting to drop dead, right? And so seeing it like that, it's almost like putting a fire out, right? Where somebody needs to do something. If you're going to be this flagrant about it and do it in the middle of everybody, then somebody has to stop it. And Phinehas makes his decision on how to stop it. And God, I don't want to say congratulates him for it, but God blesses him, right? Joanna?
What's the difference between God's righteous jealousy? Jealousy, envy, and covetousness are so closely related, but jealousy is not wanting to share what's yours. And most of the time we do that from evil motives, except for we are in a covenant relationship with our spouse. It is righteous to be jealous about your spouse. We are not to share our spouse with anyone else. And God is in a covenant relationship with his people. He is not going to share his people with any other lower G God.
Exactly. That's an incredible, and it's so clear, right? When you compare, I think that's why God in his wisdom and the way he designed marriage, that's why he uses marriage as a comparison, kind of as this metaphor for his covenant relationship with his people throughout Scripture. You're exactly right. If I covet, and no, go back to the Ten Commandments, you shall not covet your neighbor's spouse, covet your neighbor's wife, covet your neighbor's stuff. If I am mad at you because you have a bigger house than I do, that doesn't make any sense. It's not my house. But if you come into my house and steal my things, I'm allowed to be upset about that because that's not jealousy, right? And so again, in this ultimate sense, in this perfect righteous sense, God, our evil jealousy, like you said, has sinful motives, a lot of times has silly carnal motives, but God does not need to share his people. God is not going to share his people, and God has an extremely high standard for what he expects of his people. Sean?
And I like to point out that whenever people look at the Old Testament and highlight the brutality that God had for a lot of these situations, if you read farther into the Old Testament, you see the outcome of those actions. Because at that point, God says, okay, you can go ahead. I'm giving you away to these things, and you see how insane their society becomes in such a short amount of time, how they devolved into debauchery of an unimaginable scale, and then to anything that looks infinitely worse than anything than what God did. It's like, I already know what's going to happen if you do these things, and imagine if it happened here instead of after they took most of the land, right? So anytime that's pointed out, that's why I usually point back to it. You say, you see the outcome. Why would you not try to stop that?
Right. Well, and it's like the classic phrase, sin takes you farther than you want to go, costs you more than you want to pay, and keeps you longer than you want to stay, right? If you take more drastic measures sooner, sin doesn't have to do that to you. And again, on a national scale, you see that happen over and over and over again in the history of Israel. So then in verse 15 of Numbers 25, the name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur, who was the tribal head of a father's house of Midian. So again, Midian and Moab are kind of in cahoots, right? But then you also see, like we read earlier, Moab and Midian are kind of working together in these passages. But then in these last few verses, that is incorrect. That should be Numbers 31, I believe. Or no, I'm sorry, I'm not sure why it says verses 16 through 18, but just this description of who the Midianites were as people, because again, they're trying over and over again. The Moabites and the Midianites are working to get God's people to fail, right? They're trying to curse God's people. They're trying to injure God's people, right? They want God's people to be cursed. They're trying to bring them down. They see them as a threat, and so then they use this devious, deceitful, deceptive way of going about it. But then we get to Numbers 31, And Numbers 31 is, I think of David because far-reaching sin has far-reaching consequences. You just see how devastating this turns out to be. God's judgment is on Midian as a nation. We're not going to take the time to go back to those passages now, but in Deuteronomy 9 and verse 4 and in Deuteronomy chapter 18, God talks about judging nations. And he talks about judging nations for their wickedness and God is the judge of all nations, right? And so then there's these, but then also in verse 8, they killed the kings of Midian with the rest of their slain. There's all the 5 kings of Midian. They also killed Balaam the son of Beor with the sword. So then you see God fighting for his people in a very literal sense, in a very real sense, right? And then this vengeance is for God himself. If we go back to Numbers chapter 25, and verses 10 through 13, the Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the high priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and to his descendants after him the covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. But then, again, you see this vengeance where God is defending himself, right? Again, it's God's jealousy, it's righteous jealousy. It's very different than what our jealousy looks like, right? But then also, I think another detail that you see as we kind of look towards the end of this, and we look at, there's just so much seen in the last portion, also in chapter 31, verses 25, really through the end, 25 through 54 as well. You see these things being dedicated. That should say 51 through 54, not 21 through 24. So in the last few verses, you see these things being dedicated to the people of the Lord. They're as, and in the very end of chapter 31, they're as a memorial for the people of Israel before the Lord. So after these people are ransacked, after these people are destroyed, the spoils are dedicated to the Lord after they're purified. So then you also see them being burned and being washed, and you see this whole process of purifying the spoils. So there's a few difficulties. In the last couple minutes, if you'd like these slides, I'd be happy to give them to you. I don't want to rush through this slide because there's a lot of difficulties that come up with this passage. There's a lot of things that are, a lot of people, especially people who are looking to criticize the Bible in general, take big issue with Numbers 31 and what you see God doing there. But I want to end with some of the verses that were talked about earlier with 2 Peter 2 and verse 15. But turn to Jude. We'll end with the book of Jude and then one verse from Revelation, because you see more of kind of the implication of what happens to God's people in this passage. In Jude, verses 10 through 13, but these people blaspheme, talking about false teachers, these people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they are destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. Woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain of Balaam's error, and perished in Korah's rebellion. These are hidden reefs at your love feast, as they feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves. And then you see all these different metaphors for what false teachers really do. But again, you see this language of the way of Balaam, as is mentioned in 2 Peter 2 that was read earlier. And then in Revelation 2, we have the letters to the 7 churches of Asia. And in Revelation 2 and verse 14, writing to the church in Pergamum, you read, "But I have a few things against you. you have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. So what's incredible is even centuries later, this story is serving as this kind of this metaphor, but also this, God saying, remember the way of Balaam, this way that loves sorcery and sin and manipulation and false teaching and all of these different things. The way of Balaam is the way that makes people stumble. And so if you try and trip up God's people and get them to serve something other than him, that's going to have incredibly grave consequences for you. So on that note, I will see you all next week.